So in chapters 3 and 4 in Haught, he's laying out both the positions of a variety of thinkers. So he talks about the scientific materialists, Dawkins and Dennett. He talks about creationists. He talks about intelligent design. He talks about separatists, John Polkinghorne. And then the end of chapter 3 is where he lays out his positions. Okay. So remember from last time when I did the little drawing with the circles and talked about the nature of theology is trying to correlate between the contemporary context and some core aspect of whatever you find central, non-negotiable about the religious tradition or the understanding of God or something along those lines, right? And so theology is answering to both of those aspects. So what I want us to think about is how well does this evolutionary theology respond to and integrate evolutionary theory, and also how well is it grounded within, in this case, the Christian tradition from Haught's vantage point, right? So we had laid out the God of classical theology and these traits as one of comparison. You should have that in your head, or at least on notes from last time. So with the God of evolutionary theology, we talked about this God as being all good, and highlighted a passage on page 43 in chapter 3, where Haught is talking about the nature of God's grace. And we read through that, so I'm not going to do that again today. The nature of this goodness is such that God's love is characterized as being relational. For love to be relational, there has to be an other. In other words, whether we're talking about humanity as individuals or collectively, whether we're talking about the rest of creation, this is an understanding of creation that says that we're distinct from God. We're not just an extension of God. We are other than God. And so for that relationality, for that love to be manifested, the very nature of it is such that there has to be this otherness, this distinctiveness. Okay. And once we establish that, then according to Haught's understanding of evolutionary theology, what we're dealing with is a God who is super powerful, but can't by definition be all powerful, because there's something other than God that has a degree of agency, freedom, power, however you want to think about that. So God can't literally be all powerful in this conception. The understanding of power that's played out here is often described as persuasive power rather than coercive power. It's love manifested in this particular way. So on page 45 in chapter 3, look at the bottom of 44 to the top of 45. Haught says, but isn't the use of persuasion a sign of weakness rather than power? After Darwin, can theology still hold that God is a God of power and might? Process theology. So process theology is sort of a broader category that I would say evolutionary theology is an example of. And so some of the language that he's using is kind of coming from this school of thought. Process theology responds that if power means, quote, the capacity to influence, then a persuasive God is much more powerful than a hypothetical deity who magically forces things to correspond immediately to the divine intentions. A coercive deity, one that an immature religiosity often wishes for, and that our scientific skeptics almost invariably have in mind when they assert that Darwin has destroyed theism, would not allow for the otherness, autonomy, and self-coherence necessary for the world to be a world unto itself. Such a stingy and despotic forcefulness, by refusing to favor the independence of creation, would clearly be less influential in the final analysis than a God who wills the independence of the world. A world given lease to become more and more autonomous, even to help create itself, and eventually attain the status of human consciousness and freedom, has much more integrity and value than any conceivable world determined in every respect by an external divine designer. If by persuasion rather than coercion, something greater than a puppet-like universe is permitted to come into being, then we can say that persuasive power is more influential than brute force. So in that passage, you've got him responding to atheists, Dawkins and Dennett, who are saying the concept of God that evolution undermines is the God of classical theology, the all-powerful God. That's not problematized as much here. You've got him responding to intelligent design advocates who say that their theology is too small. It's too narrowly focused on design, and it doesn't recognize things like novelty that I'll mention in a minute. He goes on there to talk about ways that this concept of God would make sense with how God would interact with the rest of creation too, the non-human aspects of creation. In this theology, this God is still all present, just as we saw in classical theology. Whereas in classical theology, transcendence was emphasized more than immanence. Here, the idea of immanence, so a God within, is much more much more important. So it's a close God. It's a God that's within. It's a God that's throughout. It's among us, within all of creation. That's not to say that there's not a degree of transcendence. It's still not. It's just not as emphasized as immanence. The spatial metaphor that we use to talk about the God of classical theology was God who's up above, right? So when I asked you to point to where you imagine God to be, most people point up. This is a God who is described as up ahead, drawing us, luring us into the future. Okay, again, it's a spatial metaphor. It's not to be taken literally. It's not a God who's absent from the present, but within the present. This is not explicitly addressed in the Haught chapters, but virtually all forms of process theology that I've seen, and so I'm including it here, talks about the knowledge of God as limited by comparison with what we might think of when considering the God of classical theology. So within this realm, there's a sense of the future being genuinely open. The future has not happened. Any of these possibilities are still out there. And so because the future hasn't happened, it's not just that we don't know the future, but God doesn't know the future either. Just as we can talk about this God as ultra powerful, but not all powerful in the classical sense, when we're talking about knowledge, we're still talking about a God who knows the universe and every detail in it and every aspect of us intimately. But God can't know the future with absolute certainty. So God can know with the highest degree of probability possible what we might do in the next moment, in the next day, with our lives, but not with absolute certainty because we haven't moved to that moment, to that next day, to the future of our lives. Okay. This is a God who is sometimes described as unchanging in purpose and character, but changing in the sense of being relational with human beings, with all of creation, responsive to our joys and our sufferings, constantly present as an empathetic force. Okay. This one way to like a silly way to illustrate how this theology would work. Imagine that you're going to lunch and you've got a couple of offerings. You've got a turkey sandwich or a ham sandwich. Okay. So we have genuine free will. We are freely choosing what we're about to eat. God is constantly present, wanting the best possible thing to come out of circumstances for us. Wanting the best possible thing result out of every moment, but not being able to guarantee that we'll choose along the lines that God wants us to choose. It's not a coercive God. So this God is constantly there, persuading us to choose what God understands to be the best possible thing. This God is not all-knowing, but knows that the ham has been sitting there for a week and getting a little funky and probably going to make us sick if we eat it. Probably going to, right? So this God is privy to knowledge that we might not be, that other people might not be. This God is present in the sense of, I almost imagine it as kind of almost like your conscience, the voice in your head that is saying, hopefully you guys hear voices in your head occasionally, at least one voice, is saying, choose the turkey, choose the turkey, choose the turkey, because if you choose the ham, it's not going to go well, right? We have genuine free will. We can choose whichever we want. God does not know which one we're going to choose. We decide we're going to ignore that voice and go with the ham, okay? Lo and behold, we get sick. God is constantly present. God is going to say, go buy some Tums, go buy some Pepto. Again, we have the opportunity of saying, you know what, I'm good, I'm going to pass on that. Or, yeah, that's a good idea, I'm going to follow that. Okay, so God constantly wants the good to come out of each situation. Can't enforce God's will on us. We have genuine freedom. Constantly present. So this is not a God who intervenes from outside. It's a God who's constantly there and doesn't know the future with absolute certainty because the future hasn't happened. Okay. Again, the way that we evaluate theology in terms of metaphorical theology is, does it address the contemporary context? So just thinking about the nature of evolution, some aspects that we've talked about that seem to problematize traditional classical models of God. We can talk about the randomness and unpredictability that is evident within evolutionary history. Haught's going to say that this theology prizes this notion of novelty that Abigail had mentioned last time. Newness is good. We don't want everything to be so stuck in a rut and predictable and ordinary and that sort of thing, because there's no point to life if there's not novelty, if there's not something exciting, if there's not something new coming in. If we just had that aspect, though, it would move towards chaos. So in this view, novelty is balanced by order. So natural selection gives us a reason why this particular species might survive and this one doesn't. This particular trait is selected for, quote unquote, selected for, this one isn't. So there's some degree of order that's balanced. And then in terms of time, this concept of God fits with the massive amount of time that we now know our universe has been around for. If you're dealing with a God who's not all powerful, this isn't a God who just snaps God's fingers and makes existence into being, doesn't just bring about everything in its finished form. So he keeps stressing the nature of creation is ongoing, it's continuous. That would be something that would have to take time to unfold. Okay, so I think it's fairly non-controversial to say that this notion of God fits better with evolutionary theory than the classical model does. The question then also becomes how, to put it bluntly, how Christian is it? So throughout chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, when he's laying this out, and especially into chapter 4, that becomes his concern. So he's going to develop, is this biblically based in a sense? Is this consistent with the life of Jesus? And so on, right? So he gives examples in terms of, he focuses mostly in terms of Jesus. You can draw out, I would say both classical theology and evolutionary theology are biblically based. You can find resources in the Bible to support either one, okay? To highlight biblical examples from the Hebrew Bible, several times throughout the Hebrew Bible, you've got God negotiating with humans to come to the best possible end. So you've got, I think it's Abraham who's sort of bartering with God about how many people will be killed for not following the will of God. You've got the famous story of Noah and the ark, where God sends the flood and then seemingly like regrets it and says like, oh, this is an overreaction. Here's a rainbow. Sorry about that. That's evidence of a responsive God. That's a God who's not unchanging, who is changing in response to reality and to what's going on a human level, but also on a wider cosmic level. Then as he moves into 4, he's gonna hold up Jesus as absolutely consistent with this model of God. Jesus is not particularly all-powerful, all-knowing, those sorts of things. So he highlights, he talks about God as vulnerable, defenseless, humble. He talks about this concept of kenosis, which is self-emptying, God who's self-emptying. And so at least Haught is wanting to make the case that this is also a Christian theology. Okay. So I'll pause there. Questions that anybody has in terms of Haught's understanding, and we can start to move into sort of what do we think of this, evaluating it if you want to. Right?
How is self-emptying not coercive? Or like, how is self-emptying supposed to be like conceptual?
It's God emptying God's self.
But I mean, like, are we inviting that? Because you're saying like it's not.
It's the nature of God is self-emptying. The Haught's not saying that in that sense Jesus is a model for human behavior.
Okay.
It's not a call for Christians to empty. There's a degree of, I mean, it kind of plays into the Jesus as example of selfless suffering. So like to be a good Christian, I should put the needs of others before myself. There's a notion of selflessness that is highlighted as a result of that, but it would always be voluntary.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other questions? You guys heard of process theology before? Do you know a particular thinker that you talk about? You got a couple head shakes, but no. Okay.
I've just heard like the term, but I don't know that I've ever like read anything of process.
Okay. So he references Alfred North Whitehead is kind of the grandfather of process philosophy, and then when it comes into a Christian context, the sort of next generation. So Whitehead was probably like 100 years ago, and then these guys, and the 3 guys, are active, especially like from the 50s into the. Some of them might still be alive, but 50s into the present, I would say. So they're folding in some of the philosophical aspects of process philosophy into a Christian context. So this sort of tree of theological thought becomes really influential. So you'll see aspects of it in a lot of contemporary theologians, especially contemporary Christian theologians. So the notion of different understandings of what divine power might look like in sort of a non-traditional way, that sort of discussion owes a lot to process theology. A lot of it shows up in feminist theology also, these ideas of what do we mean by goodness, what do we mean by power, and whatnot. So, what do you guys think of this concept of God? What advantages do you see? What disadvantages? We can evaluate it.
I kind of like it because I don't know. Initially, I thought maybe like the not all power thing was like a little. But I think like just a God has a plan for something. Like a plan is not a law. Like a plan is like an outline of stuff, but like it's not set in stone necessarily, like by definition of the word. So when I think about it, like in the more of like my personal life or something, like like it does make sense to me that you could think God calls people to certain vocations or something while still not imposing necessarily.
What you just described is absolutely consistent with.
I really like the God as persuasive rather than like coercive, or like what he was saying, like if God's plan meant that like every step of your life was like, well, predetermined, I guess is the only word to use, then like we don't have free will. And that's always been a point of like contention for me that I have been unable to reconcile, but like seeing God's power as like a persuasive power makes a lot more sense to me, because it answers to like human free will and like randomness and like other things happening, but it also answers to like when people say they feel called towards something or feel like they like have a purpose or feel really strongly that something is like right for them.
I think there's also a lot of merit in certain discussions of God, and it's definitely something I'm open to personally, like in how we talked, like we said, once of us took the class with cohorts about suffering. I think that it has a lot of merit in discussions about suffering and response to the Odyssey, but I'm not super sold by Haught's application of it to evolution, because the philosophy of it just doesn't hold. I don't think the logic doesn't hold without that like intelligent designer spark of like somebody to kick it off, and Haught so vehemently railed against that as unscientific and unapproved. And I don't think that is doing the work he wants it to do for it to be pertinent to evolution.
I'm not sure I particularly like the word persuasive, just in terms of the not powerful portion of it. Because persuasive sounds like you've got a parent like breathing down your neck going, this is what I want you to do. Which, I mean, I guess is in a way, like God can be described as like the ultimate parent and have that for them. But I guess personally, I'm not sure I'm convinced by the persuasiveness, because we do have free will, and I just think God supports the choices that we make, whether or not, like I'm not sure there's like persuasion. I think being called is different than being persuaded.
That's interesting, because most people would say like, kind of sounds good, but this isn't powerful enough, and you're kind of taking that still too much like presence.
I think I find that not all knowing to be confusing if you're going to pair it with all good. Because if you're not all knowing, then you're capable of like mistakes or being deceived by people. And then I guess it depends on if all good is about the intention or the outcome of your actions. In which case, if it's like just the intention, you could have plenty of people who are also all good. But if it's the outcomes, then how are you certain that all of your interventions are going to, like if you're not all knowing, you're not going to know how your interventions are going to end up.
Yeah, there's a riskiness to this, which can cut both ways. As you can think that as an advantage here or a disadvantage, right?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about what I said before in regards to the plan thing more, and like, but what I just said, it does make sense, but I think there's a bit of a tension that like if someone is diagnosed like with cancer or something, like terminal illness or something, like in this model you can say,
you know, that wasn't in God's plan, which would affirm that he's all good, or like, you know, it kind of pushes back around like the everything happens for a reason, sort of. You're not like enabling bad things happening. God is doing that. But then it still leaves with like, why do those things happen though? Because like free will has nothing to do with like making cancer. Like that just happens. Like there's nothing to do about it. So.
Yeah. You're kind of caught between the, like, everything happens for a reason, or it's totally random.
Yeah.
Right? Like, at the end of the day, it feels like it's gotta go one way or the other. So, thank you.
I was gonna challenge Tess, but we moved on.
I would say, for me, like, it kind of works like you're touching on, like, things that, like between the all good and, like, the not all knowing. And in terms of, like, you know, we talked a lot about free will, but then, like, in terms of these, like, evolution in itself and the randomness and unpredictability and that thing, like, it gives, like, God an out. But, I mean, it does, and I think in a good way, because, like, again, the things that, like cancer, like biological stuff that like literally like no one can really control that's something that's and then sort of like they're not all knowing, and I think there's still like authority in the all good. You know, because that makes sense.
So it won't necessarily be like Haught's version of it, but we're gonna constantly keep evolution as a logical starting point for the class. Some of these basic principles, some of these theological ideas, we'll kind of be coming back to again and again. So, all right, so let's turn the page to today's material, and I'll let you guys take over, Abigail and Sarah, so you can take us wherever you want to.
All right. So we kind of split it up, that I'm going to go through art with you guys, and then Sarah's going to do get some with you guys. So for sake of time, anyone who wasn't here earlier, I sent out a little email. It has an outline that we drew up. So if you guys want to follow along with that, you're more than welcome.